and traditions of the British communities that first settled them centuries ago. The names of half of the original American states refer to members of the British royal family.
Nobody in that room expected it. The evening had been moving along with the practiced smoothness of every White House state occasion, measured words, careful gestures, the kind of diplomatic theater where nothing is accidental and everything is observed. And then Donald Trump leaned toward the microphone, looked in her direction, and said something that made people stop mid-conversation. Not because it was loud. Not because it was aggressive. Because of something far harder to explain. Before we get to what he said, you need to understand why those words landed the way they did. Because this was not simply a compliment about a queen. This was a statement made in a room where every syllable carries the weight of centuries, directed at a woman whose very name has divided public opinion for decades. And the moment it left his mouth, two very different conversations started simultaneously, one in that gilded room, and one that spread across the world within minutes. What did Donald Trump actually mean? And why does it still feel unresolved? The setting alone tells you everything about the stakes involved. When the British royal family arrives at the White House, the occasion is never casual. These are two nations bound together by a relationship that stretches back further than either of them would always prefer to remember, through revolution and rivalry, through 2 world wars and a Cold War, through the kind of shared history that never fully releases its grip on the present. King Charles III and Queen Camilla walking through those doors was not simply a visit. It was a living symbol of everything those two countries have been to each other across 3 centuries. Every camera in the room was watching. Every word spoken would be replayed, dissected, translated into 40 languages before morning. Trump understood this. He always understands the room. He moved through the early part of his remarks with practiced ease. He praised King Charles with warmth and even managed a touch of humor. The crowd responded, politely and on cue, the way crowds do at these events when they're grateful for permission to smile. Everything was going smoothly. Everything was controlled. The atmosphere had that particular quality of a formal occasion running exactly as rehearsed, where every participant knows their role and plays it without visible effort. And then he turned his attention to Camilla. He called her a very, very special queen. 4 words. Repeated once for emphasis. Delivered with a deliberate slowness that made several people in that room shift their gaze, not toward Trump, but toward her. The phrase itself sounds simple. On paper, it reads as a compliment. But the way it was spoken, that slight pause before the repetition, that careful placement of each word as though they had been chosen from a longer sentence and the rest deliberately left out, made people listen differently than they had been listening a moment before. Some heard warmth. Others heard something layered. And that is precisely where the story begins. To understand why those words landed the way they did, you have to go back. Not weeks. Not months. Years. Decades, even. Because Queen Camilla is not simply a royal figure who arrived fully formed in the public consciousness. She is someone who carries an entire history with her into every room she enters, whether she chooses to or not. Her presence at any major occasion is never neutral. It never has been. Her name became one of the most publicly contested in modern British history during the years of Princess Diana. The details are well known and need no embellishment. What matters here is the emotional residue they left behind. For a significant portion of the British public and royal watchers worldwide, Camilla represented something uncomfortable about love, loyalty, and the human capacity for contradiction. She was not embraced easily. She was not forgiven quickly. For years, every public appearance came with an undercurrent of judgment that no amount of royal protocol could fully smooth away. And yet she persisted. Quietly, steadily, without grand gestures or dramatic reinventions. She showed up. She did the work. She attended the openings and the memorials and the charity visits and the military commemorations. She stood beside Charles when it was difficult and when it was unremarkable, and over time, slowly, stubbornly, public perception began to shift. By the time she became Queen Consort in 2022, the transformation was neither complete nor universal. It never is with figures who carry this much history. But it was real. Enough people had reconsidered. Enough time had passed. Enough of her had been witnessed in enough quiet moments for something like acceptance to finally take root. Which is exactly why a room full of powerful people went quiet when Donald Trump singled her out. Because when someone of his stature, in that setting, directs specific and deliberate praise at a woman whose public standing has been so hard-won and so long contested, people don't hear it as background noise. They lean in. They listen for the shape of what's being said beneath the words themselves. They search for the architecture underneath the surface. Then the footage started circulating. Within minutes of the event, a clip began spreading across social media. Brief. A few seconds at most. It showed Trump moving slightly ahead of Camilla during the greeting portion of the evening, a small physical moment, the kind that happens constantly at busy formal events where guests and officials and security details are all navigating the same space at the same time. Bodies move. People adjust. Positions shift without intention or meaning. In isolation, it means almost nothing. In context, it became everything. Because now people had two data points that didn't quite align. On one side, warm, specific, emphatic verbal praise. On the other, a body language moment that some felt didn't fully match the formality the occasion demanded. And when those two things sit beside each other without a clean explanation, the human mind does what it always does. It searches for the truth between them. Some viewers watched the clip and saw exactly what it was, a natural, unremarkable movement in a crowded room, given far more weight than it deserved. Others watched it and felt something different. They saw a gap between what was said and what was shown, and that gap pulled at them. It didn't point clearly in one direction. It simply opened a question and left it there, unanswered and unresolved. That unresolved quality is precisely what kept the conversation alive long after the evening ended. Trump also announced the removal of tariffs on Scottish whiskey during the visit, a gesture that carried its own symbolism, wrapping trade policy in the language of cultural respect, connecting diplomacy to tradition in a way that played well on both sides of the Atlantic. For some, this reinforced the warmth of his verbal praise and painted the entire evening as a genuine expression of alliance and mutual regard. For others, it only deepened the complexity, adding yet another layer to an evening that was already proving difficult to read with any confidence. This is the particular weight of public moments involving these two countries. The United States and the United Kingdom share a relationship unlike almost any other in modern geopolitics. It is an alliance built on genuine shared interest and genuine historical tension existing simultaneously, side by side, never fully resolved. The American Revolution was a divorce. Everything since has been two former family members learning, imperfectly and often reluctantly, to coexist. And when the leaders of those nations stand in the same room and speak about each other's royalty, nothing is ever simply social. It is always also historical. It is always also political. It is always symbolic in ways that resist simple explanation. Trump understands symbols. Whatever else is said about him, he has always demonstrated an acute instinct for the image, the gesture, the phrase that lands differently than it sounds. Very, very special. Said slowly. Said twice. In the White House. About Camilla. In front of cameras that would carry those words to every corner of the world before the night was over. Was it admiration? Almost certainly, at least in part. Was there something more deliberate behind the phrasing, a nod to her complicated history, an acknowledgement dressed as a compliment, praise that carried a quiet awareness of everything it was praising her despite? That is the question people who study these moments for a living are still sitting with, still turning over, still unable to answer cleanly. And it matters more than it might first appear. Because Camilla's position within the global royal conversation is never static. Every major event she attends, every high-profile mention of her name by a world leader, adds another data point to a public narrative that has been actively rewriting itself for 20 years. Trump's words, deliberate or not, entered that narrative and changed its temperature. Not dramatically. Not permanently. But enough that people noticed. Enough that they felt it shift. There is also something worth examining in the specific choice of language. Trump did not call her gracious. He did not call her elegant or poised or dignified or any of the adjectives that diplomatic speechwriters reach for automatically in these settings. He called her special. And then, as though the first time wasn't quite sufficient, he said it again. Very, very special. Special is a word that carries feeling rather than description. It doesn't tell you what someone is. It tells you how someone makes you feel. And coming from a man not widely known for emotional vocabulary, in a setting not designed for personal sentiment, it arrived with unusual and unexpected weight. Some in the room smiled. Some exchanged quiet glances. Some simply went still in the way people do when something unexpected cuts through the choreography of a formal occasion and arrives without warning, without a script, without an obvious explanation for why it feels significant. What is also worth noting is what he did not say. He did not linger on her role. He did not reference her work or her duties or the institutional position she now holds. He spoke about her as a person, specifically, as someone he found remarkable in a way that exceeded ordinary royal courtesy. In the compressed language of state occasions, where every word is chosen for maximum diplomatic efficiency, that personal quality stood apart. It made the moment feel less rehearsed than everything around it. What we do know is this. The evening ended the way these evenings always end, with handshakes and final remarks and the kind of composed, well-managed exit that leaves no visible loose ends. The cameras followed. The security details moved efficiently. The formal atmosphere softened into the polite blur of conclusion, and the official record of the night was filed away as another successful diplomatic occasion between two long-standing allies. And yet something stayed behind. Something that didn't dissolve with the music or disappear with the closing words. It stayed in the replays. In the comment sections. In the quiet conversations between people who watched the footage a second time and then a third, trying to locate the exact moment when a compliment became a question, when a simple phrase became something people couldn't quite put down. The most powerful moments in public life are rarely the ones that announce themselves. They are the ones that arrive in plain language, at formal occasions, dressed as ordinary remarks, and somehow refuse to be forgotten. For words, repeated once. A slight pause before the second very. A room full of people who noticed something without being entirely sure what they had noticed. Very, very special. Perhaps he meant exactly what he said. Perhaps in the careful diplomacy of a White House state dinner, a man known for unfiltered expression chose the most filtered version of what he genuinely felt, and what came out was real admiration, uncomplicated, straightforward, sincere, for a woman who has spent 30 years earning what should have always been simple respect. Or perhaps the deliberateness of the phrasing, the repetition, the pause, the weight behind 4 small words, was its own kind of message. Not criticism. Not contradiction. But acknowledgement. The kind that only carries meaning if you understand everything that came before it, everything she navigated to stand in that room, everything the world once said about her that she outlasted. What did Donald Trump really mean when he looked at Queen Camilla and reached for those particular words? He hasn't said. And somehow, that silence is the loudest part of the whole evening.